At my son's promotion party, I was gripping the sideboard, barely able to breathe, when my wife looked straight at me and said, "Stop making a scene. Go tell the staff to bring more wine." My son glanced over and smirked, lazy as always. Then my daughter's husband, a doctor, grabbed my wrist. His face went completely white. "Call 911, right now." For 1 second, the entire room froze, and in that silence I saw exactly who looked at me and who looked away. "I am incredibly grateful to have you here. To help us connect, please drop a comment, letting me know where you are watching, from what city or country are you in. Also, please note that this narrative blends fictionalized details for creative and educational value. Any similarity to actual names or locations is coincidental, but the core lesson remains vital for you. There is a version of a man that the world never sees. Not the man in the photographs. Not the man at the dinner table. Not the man whose name appears on a mortgage and a tax return and a company directory. I mean the man underneath all of that, the one who wakes up at 4 in the morning because his back won't let him sleep, who stands in the kitchen drinking coffee that has gone cold, who looks out the window at a neighborhood full of quiet houses and wonders very privately whether any of the other men inside them feel as alone as he does. That was me for most of my adult life. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer in New York, the kind of work that doesn't make you famous but makes cities possible. Bridges, foundations, load-bearing walls that hold up everything above them without anyone thinking twice about what's underneath. I was good at it. I understood weight. I understood pressure. I understood what it meant to carry something without showing the strain. I suppose that's why it took so long for anyone to notice I was breaking. I met Eleanor at 28. She was sharp and beautiful and certain about everything, in a way I found compelling back then. We married quickly. Julian came first, then Clara 4 years later. For a while, the house on Elmridge Drive felt like something I had earned: the yard, the 2-car garage, the smell of dinner cooking when I came home from a job site. I worked hard, because that's what I knew how to do. I told myself that was enough. Looking back now, I think I confused providing with belonging. They are not the same thing, not even close. The accident happened 15 years ago on a Tuesday in late October. I was overseeing a steel reinforcement project on the east side of Manhattan, a renovation job on an older building whose bones needed rebuilding from the inside out. I had done 100 jobs like it. But that afternoon, a rigging cable gave way on the 3rd floor, and before I could move, a section of steel framing came down and caught my left shoulder and the left side of my rib cage with enough force to throw me across the floor. I remember the sound more than the pain, a crack that seemed to come from inside my own body, and then the floor against my cheek, cold and gritty, and someone far away shouting my name. I woke up in the hospital. Not a private room, we didn't have that kind of coverage at the time, and Eleanor had always insisted we keep the household accounts in her name, which meant the insurance decisions went through her first. I was in a shared ward with 5 other men separated by curtains the color of old cream. My shoulder had been fractured. 2 ribs were cracked. The doctors told me I would need 8 weeks of recovery before I could return to any kind of physical work. 8 weeks. I called Eleanor from the hospital phone that first evening. She picked up on the 4th ring. "I heard," she said before I could explain. Her voice had that particular flatness it got when she was managing her reaction rather than having one. "How bad is it?" "2 cracked ribs, fractured shoulder," I said. "They want to keep me here for observation. A few days, maybe more." There was a pause. I heard Julian's voice in the background. He was 9 years old, then already practicing the particular tone of impatience he would perfect over the next 15 years. Eleanor covered the phone and said something to him I couldn't make out. "Arthur," she said when she came back, "Julian has his academic showcase on Friday. We already confirmed with the school." I held the phone and stared at the ceiling of the shared ward. My ribs screamed with every breath. "Okay," I said. I just want to make sure we're on the same page about what's a priority right now, she said. I told her I understood. And I did. I understood exactly what she was telling me without saying it directly. My injury was an inconvenience. The schedule would continue. I was expected to arrange myself around it. She visited once in the 4 days I was there. She wore a good coat and sat in the chair beside my bed with her handbag in her lap, and she told me that some of the neighbors had asked what happened, and she had told them I slipped on a job site because she didn't want people thinking I was careless. I nodded. I thanked her for coming. Julian visited with her and sat in the corner of the room with his arms crossed, looking at the other patients with unconcealed distaste. He was 9, but already he had learned that certain environments were beneath him. He did not ask how I felt. When Eleanor said it was time to leave, he stood up immediately relieved. "Try not to be here too long," Eleanor said at the door. Not unkindly, not cruelly, just practically the way you might remind someone not to leave the oven on. She pulled the curtain closed behind them, and I lay there in the blue afternoon light of that shared ward and told myself this was what marriage looked like after enough years. Practical, efficient, not unkind. I almost believed it. What happened 3 days later, I have carried quietly for 15 years, and I have told almost no one. It was a Thursday evening around 6 o'clock. The ward was settling into its after-dinner quiet, the particular stillness of a room full of people, trying not to think too hard about their own bodies. I was attempting to read a magazine someone had left on the chair, holding it awkwardly because lifting my left arm more than a few inches sent fire down my side. I heard the curtain move. Clara slipped through the gap with the careful deliberateness of a child who has practiced being quiet so as not to get caught. She was 7 years old, wearing her school uniform, still her dark hair, in 2 uneven braids that she had clearly done herself. In her hands was a plastic container, the kind we kept leftovers in, wrapped in a dish towel to keep it warm. She had taken the subway alone. 40 minutes, 2 transfers. She had asked a woman at the station to help her read the map because she wasn't sure which line to take. She told me all of this in a whisper, sitting on the edge of my bed, with her feet dangling, watching me open the container. Rice. Chicken cut into pieces the way she knew I liked it. A little overcooked because she had done it herself on the stove while Eleanor was on a phone call, and she had been afraid to check too many times in case it burned. My throat tightened so fast I had to look away. "You didn't have to do this, sweetheart," I managed. Clara shrugged with the particular nonchalance of a 7-year-old, trying very hard to seem casual. "I know," she said, "but I wanted to." She watched me take the first bite, and when I told her it was good, and it genuinely was, she broke into a smile so wide it took up her whole face and my heart cracked open in a way that had nothing to do with ribs. She stayed for an hour. She told me about her week at school, about a book she was reading, about a bird that had been sitting on the windowsill of their classroom every morning. She talked the way children talk when they are trying to fill a space with something good. When the ward nurse gently told her visiting hours were ending, she hugged me carefully because somehow she already knew which side hurt and whispered, "Come home soon, Dad." I watched her small figure disappear through the curtain and felt something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with the fractured bones. That was the first time I truly understood what my family was. Not the version I had been telling myself, the practical, efficient, good enough version. The real version. Eleanor and Julian in the good coat, and the crossed arms staying 30 minutes and leaving relieved. And Clara, 7 years old, 2 subway transfers, a container of slightly overcooked chicken, and an hour of stories about a bird on a windowsill. I washed my face in the small bathroom at the end of the ward that night, and made myself look at the man in the mirror for a long time. I had built structures designed to carry weight for decades without failing. I understood better than most what happened when a foundation was flawed from the beginning. Stress accumulated, cracks spread, and eventually, without warning, something gave way. I told myself I was strong enough to hold it together. I told myself it would get better. I told myself a lot of things in that bathroom mirror the way men do when the truth is too heavy to carry all at once. That was the first time I understood what my family truly thought of me. It would not be the last. 5 years ago, I discovered my son had stolen from me, and I chose to say nothing. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I explain it, because I know how it sounds. I know what a reasonable person thinks when they hear a father say something like that. They think weakness. They think denial. They think, what kind of man allows that? I have asked myself the same question every single day since. It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. It was a Thursday evening in March 5 years ago, this past spring. I was sitting at the desk in the small room off the hallway that I used as a home office, going through the quarterly statements for the retirement account I had been building since my late 30s. After the accident, the workers' compensation settlement had given me a modest payout, enough to cover the medical bills and leave a remainder that I had invested carefully over the years, adding to it whenever the consulting work allowed. $212,000. 23 years of discipline of saying no to things we could have afforded so that there would be something left when the work finally ran out. The phone rang. A number I didn't recognize, but a New York area code. Mr. Pendleton. The voice was professional, measured a woman who introduced herself as a compliance officer at a mid-sized brokerage firm downtown. She said she was calling because their internal audit had flagged an account opened in my name approximately 4 months earlier, and they wanted to verify that I had authorized the transactions associated with it. I told her I didn't have an account at their firm. There was a pause on her end that lasted just long enough to tell me something was wrong. Mr. Pendleton, she said carefully, the account was opened with your social security number, your date of birth, and a copy of your driver's license. Over the past 3 months, it has received transfers totaling $200,000 from an external savings account registered in your name at First Capital Bank. My hand tightened around the phone so hard my knuckles went pale. I'm going to need you to repeat that number, I said. She repeated it. $200,000. Gone. Transferred out in increments small enough to avoid automatic reporting thresholds, a technique she explained with practiced neutrality that suggested whoever had done this knew what they were doing. I sat at that desk for a very long time after I hung up. I pulled up my First Capital account on the computer. The balance I had been watching grow for 2 decades had been hollowed out, not all at once, but over 11 separate transactions spanning 14 weeks, each one just under the federal reporting limit of $10,000. Whoever had done this had been careful, methodical, patient. I already knew who it was. Julian had been home for the winter break from the international finance program in London that Eleanor and I had been paying for. He had asked to use my home office one afternoon to print some documents, and I had said yes without thinking about it, the way you say yes to things that seem harmless. He had been at my desk for about 40 minutes. At the time, I assumed he was printing course materials. Now I understood what he had actually been doing. My chest felt hollow in a way that had nothing to do with my old injury. I opened the desk drawer and took out the folder where I kept the account statements, and my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped it the first time I tried to pick it up. Papers scattered across the floor, years of careful record-keeping, spread out like evidence of everything I had built and everything that had just been taken. I got down on my knees on that floor and gathered them up one by one. My vision blurred and I realized my eyes were burning, and I pressed the heel of my hand against them hard because I had not cried since the hospital 15 years ago, and I was not going to start on a Thursday night in a room that smelled like old paper and printer ink. It took me a long time to stand back up. I called the compliance officer back and told her that I believed the account had been opened by a family member without my authorization. I told her I needed a few days before deciding whether to file a formal complaint. She was professionally sympathetic in the way people are when they have heard this particular story before. She told me the firm would place a hold on the fraudulent account and that the window for filing was open, but that I should be aware of New York's statute of limitations for wire fraud, 6 years from the date of the last transaction. 6 years. It was the first time I had ever been grateful for a number I didn't want to need. I sat at that desk until almost midnight. I thought about calling the police that night. I thought about it seriously, picked up the phone twice, put it down twice. Julian was 19 years old and in his second year of what everyone, including Eleanor, described as a brilliant academic career. He had a future that looked from the outside like everything a father works toward. Top of his program. Internship offers already coming in. The kind of trajectory that people pointed to at family gatherings and said, "You must be so proud." And I was. Underneath the rage and the grief and the sick feeling that had taken up residence behind my sternum, I was still. God help me proud of him. Or proud of the idea of him, the version I had been holding on to since he was a small boy who used to fall asleep in the car on the way home from the park. His cheek pressed against the window, completely trusting that someone would carry him inside. That boy and the man who had spent 14 weeks systematically emptying my retirement account could not both exist. And yet they did. I folded the statements and put them in a separate envelope at the back of the drawer. I told myself I was giving it time. I told myself I would confront him when the moment was right. I told myself a great many things alone in that room, in the particular darkness of a house that was asleep and didn't know what I knew. What I did not tell myself, what I refused to look at directly, was the real reason I stayed quiet. It wasn't just love. It wasn't even mostly love. It was the terrifying possibility that if I said the words out loud, if I stood in front of my son and said, "I know what you did, and I have the paperwork to prove it," he would look at me without remorse. And I would have to live with that. I would have to absorb the fact that the boy I had broken my body to educate, the boy I had worked through pain to provide for, was capable of looking his father in the eye after stealing his future and feeling nothing. I wasn't ready for that. So I put it in a drawer. I closed the drawer. I turned off the desk lamp. I walked upstairs in the dark and got into bed next to a woman who was already asleep and who would never ask what I had been doing alone downstairs for 4 hours. And I told myself I would deal with it later. Later became a week, a month, a year, and then 5. But I kept the envelope. That part matters. Through every dinner where Julian talked about his portfolio strategies, and Eleanor beamed at him like he had invented money itself, through every holiday and every phone call and every moment where the words rose in my throat and I swallowed them back down, I kept the envelope. Because some part of me buried under all that silence already knew that later would eventually come. I just didn't know it would arrive the way it did on a Friday night in September, at a party I had been asked to serve rather than attend, with my chest closing like a fist, and my son watching me struggle to breathe, and saying without even looking up from his drink, "Dad's being lazy again." The invitation arrived on a Monday morning, slipped under my bedroom door while I was getting dressed. Not a card, not a phone call, a list. Eleanor's handwriting, precise and deliberate, the kind that never left room for misinterpretation. 12 items numbered with a note at the top that said, "Arthur for Friday. Please handle before 6. The list included picking up 3 cases of imported wine from a shop 40 minutes away, rearranging the dining room furniture to accommodate a rented table, polishing the silverware that only came out when Eleanor wanted someone to see it, and coordinating with the catering staff she had hired about the correct placement of the appetizer stations. There was no "please join us for Julian's promotion party." There was only the list. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom, holding that piece of paper, and felt something move through me that was too tired to be anger. It had passed through anger years ago and come out the other side into something quieter and more permanent. The kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself anymore, just settles into your bones like an old weather pattern you've stopped bothering to predict. I folded the list and put it in my shirt pocket. I went downstairs and made coffee. And I told myself, for what I did not yet know would be the last time, that this was fine. Friday came the way those evenings always did, too fast and too loud. The house transformed into something that belonged to everyone except the man who had paid for it. By 4 in the afternoon, Eleanor was directing the catering staff through the kitchen with the focused energy of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. She had a new dress, deep burgundy fitted, and her hair was done in a way that made her look like she was attending the party rather than hosting it. "Arthur," she called from the kitchen doorway without looking at me. "The wine is still in the hallway. It needs to be in the dining room before the guests arrive." "I'll get it," I said. "Now please, not in an hour." I carried the cases of wine one at a time from the hallway to the dining room. Each case weighed about 30 pounds. My shoulder, the left one, the one that had never fully forgiven the accident 15 years ago, sent up a quiet, steady protest with every trip, the kind of pain that doesn't spike dramatically, but simply maintains itself like a note held too long. By the time I finished, I was breathing carefully, not the desperate way, not yet, but deliberately, the way you do when your body is telling you to slow down, and you are choosing to negotiate rather than listen. Julian arrived home at 5:30, fresh from the office, already dressed for the evening, in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first month's salary as an engineer. He walked through the door the way he always did, as though the house had been rearranged specifically for his arrival, which tonight it essentially had been. "The Hendersons confirmed," he said to Eleanor, setting his phone on the counter without breaking stride. "And I need someone to make sure the McAllen is out before Victor gets here. He doesn't drink wine." "I'll take care of it," Eleanor said, touching his arm briefly, as he passed the kind of quick, warm contact she reserved for him and for public photographs. Julian glanced at me across the kitchen. I was refilling a water pitcher near the sink. He looked at me the way you look at furniture. You are mildly surprised to find still in the room. "You're wearing that," he said. I looked down at my shirt, clean, pressed the good blue one I had ironed that morning. "I thought I'd change before. Just stay out of the main room if you can," he said, and turned back to Eleanor. "Where did you put the seating cards?" I stayed out of the main room. Clara arrived at 6, just as the first guests were pulling into the driveway. She came through the back door, the one that opened into the kitchen, with a covered dish in her hands, and her husband, Thomas, just behind her. His hand resting lightly on her back, in the easy, natural way of a man who has learned where his wife's tension lives and knows how to answer it without being asked. Thomas Albright was 31 years old and in his 3rd year of residency in the emergency department at Mercy General Hospital in Manhattan. The kind of doctor who had chosen the hardest rotations deliberately, who ate vending machine sandwiches between 12-hour shifts and never complained about it, and whose instinct for noticing when something was physically wrong with a person had become, by that point in his training, almost involuntary. He shook my hand at the door, and his grip was firm, but his eyes were already doing that quiet, professional scan that I had noticed him do before, a habit so ingrained he probably wasn't aware of it, taking in the room, the people looking for anything that needed attention. "Arthur," he said, and smiled. "Good to see you. How are you feeling?" "Fine," I said, because that was what I said. He held my gaze for just a fraction of a second longer than the question required, and I saw something flicker in his expression, not alarm, not yet just the small notation of a man who has learned that fine is sometimes the least informative answer a person can give. Clara set the dish on the counter and turned to me with both arms open. She hugged me the way she always had, fully without reserve, the way she had hugged me since she was 7 years old, arriving at a hospital ward with a container of rice and chicken. She smelled like the vanilla soap she'd used since college, and her embrace lasted exactly long enough to say what she didn't put into words. "Mom put me on salad duty," she murmured near my ear, and I could hear the dry humor in it, the quiet acknowledgement between us that some things never changed. I heard, I murmured back. She pulled away and looked at my face for a moment, with those steady brown eyes that had always seen more than I wanted them to. You look tired, Dad. It's been a long week, has it? She held my gaze just a breath too long, and then Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, Clara, the salad greens need to be torn, not cut. I've mentioned this. And just like that, the moment was over. Clara went to the greens. Thomas drifted toward the living room, where the early guests were beginning to gather, men in expensive suits, women with statement jewelry, the specific social vocabulary of Julian's world, where accomplishment was worn on the outside and performed for the room. I went back to the hallway to carry the last case of wine. By 7 o'clock, the party was in full motion. The dining room glittered. Julian stood at the center of it, effortlessly, commanding laughing at the right moments, leaning in at the right moments, working the room with the practiced ease of a man who had studied other people's power and learned to wear it like a second skin. Across the room near the window that overlooked the garden stood a man I didn't immediately recognize, tall, silver-haired, with the self-contained bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in any room he entered. He was listening to Julian with an expression of measured attention, the kind that gave nothing away, but missed nothing either. Something about him tugged at the edge of my memory, but I couldn't place it. I told myself I'd think of it later. I was in the kitchen doorway, holding a tray of empty glasses I'd been asked to return to the catering station when the first real tightening came. Not pain exactly. Not yet. More like a reminder, a quiet, insistent pressure behind my sternum that I had learned over the past several months to take seriously even when I didn't want to. I set the tray down on the counter and pressed one hand flat against the edge, breathing slowly. The noise of the party continued around me, laughter. Ice in glasses, someone telling a story that made the room erupt in approval. Julian's voice above it all, warm and assured, playing host to everyone except his father. I picked up another case of wine and told myself I was fine. My chest told me something different. The second tightening came without warning. I had just set the last case of wine on the dining room sideboard and straightened up too quickly, as it turned out, when the pressure behind my sternum stopped being a suggestion and became a demand. It moved up into my jaw, down my left arm, and settled across my chest, like something heavy had been placed there without my permission. I stood very still for a moment, one hand on the sideboard trying to breathe through it, the way I had taught myself to breathe through the shoulder pain, slowly, deliberately, waiting for it to pass. It did not pass. The room around me continued as though nothing had shifted. 40 people in good clothes, holding good wine, laughing at things that deserved maybe half the laughter they were getting. The music was low and tasteful. The catering staff moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of people paid to be unnoticed. Julian was near the fireplace, commanding the attention of a small circle of colleagues with a story I couldn't hear from where I stood. I tried to take a full breath. What came back was maybe half of one. I reached for the edge of the sideboard again, steadier this time, and tried to think clearly. The symptoms were familiar in the way that a warning you have been ignoring for months becomes familiar, not comfortable, but recognized. The jaw, the arm, the pressure. I had felt versions of this before, smaller versions, and I had told myself each time that it was stress, that it was the old injury, that it was nothing a good night's sleep wouldn't fix. This was not a smaller version. Arthur? Eleanor's voice from somewhere to my left. I turned my head carefully because turning it too fast made the pressure spike. She was standing near the kitchen doorway, with a look on her face that I recognized immediately, not concern, but awareness. The awareness of a woman who has noticed that something in her party is about to become a complication. "You're in the middle of the room," she said, keeping her voice low and smooth. "Can you move to the side, please? The servers need that space." I opened my mouth to tell her. 3 words, I need help. The simplest sentence in the English language. I had been married to this woman for 28 years, and I could not make those 3 words leave my body. What came out instead was, "Eleanor, I can't. Enough," she said. And her voice hardened in that particular way it had, the way that closed a conversation, like a door being shut firmly rather than slammed. "Enough drama. Go to the kitchen and tell the staff we need more wine opened. The Bordeaux, not the Pinot." She turned away before I finished the sentence. Back to her party. Back to her guests. Back to the version of the evening she had been planning for 3 weeks and would not allow to be interrupted. I looked at my hand on the sideboard. My fingers had gone pale where they gripped the wood. Julian appeared at my peripheral vision, moving through the room toward the bar, smooth and purposeful, the charcoal suit catching the light. He glanced at me the way he had glanced at me in the kitchen earlier, that brief, faintly irritated flicker of a man who finds an obstacle in a place where there shouldn't be one. Dad. Not a question. Not a greeting. Just a word used like a tap on the shoulder. "You're blocking the server lane. Can you just—" He gestured vaguely toward the wall. "Julian." My voice came out wrong, thinner than I intended, with a catch in it I couldn't control. "I don't feel well." He looked at me then. Really looked for maybe 2 seconds. And I watched something move across his face, not alarm, not urgency. Annoyance. The specific annoyance of someone whose carefully constructed evening is being threatened by an inconvenient variable. "You're fine," he said. "You've been moving boxes all afternoon. Drink some water." He glanced toward the fireplace where his circle of colleagues was waiting. "And Dad, try not to make a scene. Victor's here." He turned and walked back toward the fireplace. My knees went soft. I don't know exactly how I ended up in the chair, one of the wooden dining chairs, that had been pulled to the edge of the room to make space for the standing guests. I think I moved there myself deliberately, because some part of my brain that was still functioning clearly understood that if I stayed standing, I was going to fall, and falling in the middle of Julian's party was apparently something I was still, even then, trying to avoid. I sat in that chair with both hands pressed flat on my thighs and focused on breathing. In, a little, out. Repeat. Someone noticed. Not Eleanor. Not Julian. Not any of the 40 guests who had been eating food and drinking wine in my house for the past 2 hours. Thomas noticed. I saw him from across the room. He had been near the window talking to a couple I didn't know. And something must have shifted in his peripheral awareness, because he stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at me. I watched his expression change, not dramatically, not in the way of someone reacting to a spectacle, in the precise, quiet way of a doctor whose brain has just received information that overrides everything else. He was across the room in 8 steps. He crouched in front of my chair, one hand on my wrist, fingers pressed to my pulse point. His face was close enough that I could see exactly what happened to it. When he felt what he felt, the color went out of it, fast and completely, the way a light gets switched off. "Arthur." His voice was low and even and absolutely serious. "Look at me. Don't talk. Just look at me and keep breathing." I looked at him. My left arm felt like it was being pressed down by something I couldn't see. The pressure in my chest had spread upward, filling my throat. Thomas stood up straight. He turned toward the room with the full-body authority of a man who has stood at the center of emergencies and learned that hesitation costs more than certainty. "Call 911, he shouted. "Right now, call 911. The room stopped. Not gradually, not the way conversations taper off when something catches attention. All at once. 40 people, mid-sentence, mid-laugh, mid-sip, and then nothing. A single held breath. In that silence, I saw everything with the particular clarity of a moment that the brain decides to keep forever. I saw Eleanor standing near the bar with a glass of red wine in her hand. Her eyes found me across the room. She looked at me for one full second, And then she looked down at her glass, raised it slightly, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I saw Julian. He had turned from his circle near the fireplace, and his eyes moved from Thomas to me, to the man beside him, the silver-haired man I had seen earlier by the window, whose name I still couldn't place. Julian's expression did not collapse into fear. It arranged itself quickly and carefully into calculation. Neither of them moved toward me. In that 1 second of silence, I saw my wife reach for her wine glass. I saw my son look at his boss. Neither of them looked at me. The ambulance arrived in 4 minutes. It took 11 to reach me. I know the exact numbers because Thomas told me later in the hospital, with the kind of controlled fury that careful people allow themselves only after the emergency has passed and the adrenaline has somewhere safe to go. 4 minutes from the call to the driveway. 11 minutes from the driveway to my chair in the dining room. 7 minutes lost to a detour that should never have happened. I was not fully conscious for all of it. What I have is fragments, the particular crystalline fragments that the brain preserves from moments of physical crisis, sharp-edged and out of sequence like photographs scattered across a floor. I remember the sound of the front door opening and Julian's voice, low and urgent, intercepting the paramedics before they could come through. I couldn't make out the words from where I sat, but I recognized the tone, the smooth, authoritative register he used in professional settings, the one that made people assume he knew what he was talking about. Thomas heard it too. He had been crouched beside my chair, one hand still on my wrist, the other pressed flat against my back, talking to me in the even, unhurried voice he used when he needed a patient to stay present. "Arthur, stay with me. Keep breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. That's it." When Julian's voice drifted in from the hallway, something shifted in Thomas's posture. A tightening, almost imperceptible the way a person braces before they say something they know is going to cost them. "Don't move," he told me and stood up. I heard him cross the room quickly. Then his voice sharper, now stripped of the calm he had been using for my benefit. "What are you doing? I called 911. Why aren't they coming through the front?" Julian's response was even almost bored. "The front entrance is blocked by the valet setup. I'm directing them around to the service entrance. It's faster." "It is not faster," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice that I had never heard from him before. Not anger exactly, but a precision that was more cutting than anger. "The service entrance adds 3 minutes minimum. He is having a cardiac event. Every minute matters." "Thomas." Julian's voice dropped lower. "Victor Sterling is standing 15 feet from that front door. I am not having an ambulance roll through the middle of my promotion party." A pause, brief and terrible. "I don't care," Thomas said. I heard footsteps, Thomas moving back through the house, and then other voices, the professional clipped exchanges of paramedics being redirected, and then the sound of equipment moving, and doors, and the particular organized chaos of emergency personnel doing their jobs in a space that was not designed for it. It took 7 more minutes. I spent those 7 minutes in the dining chair, with my hands on my thighs, and the pressure in my chest unchanged, watching the party guests redistribute themselves to the edges of the room with the uncomfortable shuffle of people who do not know whether to leave or stay. The music had stopped at some point. Someone had turned off the overhead chandelier and switched on the smaller lamps, which made the room feel smaller and more serious, like a stage after the performance has ended. Eleanor stood near the bar. She had set down her wine glass finally, but she held her evening bag in both hands in front of her, working the clasp with her thumb open and closed, open and closed. She was looking at me, but her expression was the one she wore when she was calculating. Not feeling calculating, running numbers on a situation to determine the most favorable outcome. She did not cross the room. When the paramedics finally reached me, Thomas was 2 steps ahead of them, talking fast and precise cardiac symptoms, duration, relevant medical history he had gathered from Clara over the past hour current presentation. He spoke the way he must have spoken 100 times in the emergency department, efficiently, without drama giving them exactly what they needed and nothing they didn't. One of the paramedics, a woman with her hair pulled back, and the unhurried confidence of someone who has responded to 1,000 of these calls, knelt in front of me and took my face in both hands gently and looked directly into my eyes. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, "I've got you. Can you tell me where the pain is?" "Chest," I said. "Left arm, jaw." On a scale of 1 to 10, I thought about it honestly. 7, I said, moving toward 8. She nodded, already reaching for equipment, and something about the straightforward competence of that nod. The simple, uncomplicated fact of a stranger doing her job with full attention made my eyes burn in a way that had nothing to do with pain. They moved me to a stretcher. The logistics of it required navigating through the dining room, past the catering table, past the guests, pressed against the walls, past Julian, who stood near the fireplace with his arms crossed and his face arranged into the expression of a man managing a public relations situation. As the stretcher passed him, he leaned slightly toward Thomas and said quietly, "This didn't need to be this dramatic." Thomas stopped walking. Just for a moment. He turned and looked at Julian with an expression I wish I could have seen more clearly. Whatever it contained, it made Julian take one small, involuntary step backward. Thomas didn't say anything. He turned back and kept walking beside me. The paramedics loaded me through the front door. They had come through the front after Thomas redirected them, regardless of the valet setup, regardless of the optics, and the night air hit my face cool and sharp and real, the way outside air always feels after too long in a closed room. They lifted the stretcher into the ambulance. Thomas spoke briefly to the lead paramedic, then squeezed my shoulder once firm, present the unspoken language of someone who intends to follow. The doors began to close. In the last moment before they shut, I turned my head and looked back at the house. Every window was lit. The warm yellow glow of chandeliers and table lamps spilled out across the lawn, beautiful and indifferent. Through the dining room window, I could see movement guests, resettling someone refilling a glass, the slow reassertion of an evening that had been briefly interrupted. The party was still going, the doors closed, and I was alone with strangers who were treating me like I mattered on my way to a place where no one knew my son's name. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of my house lit up and beautiful from the outside. The party was still going. Somewhere between the siren and the hospital lights, I started to remember. Not deliberately. Not in the organized, sequential way that a man reviews his life when he has the luxury of time and distance. This was the other kind, the kind that comes when the body is occupied with surviving and the mind slips its leash and goes somewhere it has been avoiding for years. Fragments. Voices. The specific weight of moments I had told myself didn't matter as much as they did. The female paramedic was talking to me, asking questions in a steady rhythm. Name, date of birth, medications, allergies, and I answered each one. But a part of me was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that smelled like the interior of a different car 24 years ago, driving home from the hospital the day Julian was born. I remembered holding him in the parking garage before we got into the car. Eleanor had gone ahead to sign discharge papers, and I had stood there alone with this 7-pound, 3-ounce person who had not yet learned to do anything except exist. And I had felt something so large and so terrifying move through my chest that I couldn't name it then, and can barely name it now. It was the feeling of understanding for the first time what it meant to have something worth losing. I had whispered to him in that parking garage with no one listening. I had said, "I've got you. Whatever happens, I've got you." 24 years. 24 years of school plays and science projects and arguments about curfews and the particular silence of a house with a teenager who had decided you were no longer necessary. 24 years of tuition payments and reference letters and the careful navigation of a relationship that kept restructuring itself into something I didn't recognize but kept trying to understand. 24 years of Julian calling me by my name at family dinners, a habit that had started when he was 16 and that Eleanor had called mature, and that I had said nothing about not once, not ever. When had he stopped calling me Dad? The question arrived with the particular precision of something that has been waiting a long time to be asked. I lay on the stretcher in the back of that ambulance, and I tried to remember the last time my son had said that word to me, and really meant it, the way a child means it, when they are small enough to believe that a father is the largest and most reliable thing in the world. I couldn't find it. I searched through 24 years, and I couldn't locate a single moment in the past decade where that word had come from him and carried anything real inside it. The oxygen mask shifted on my face, and I realized my breathing had changed shallower faster, and the paramedic's hand touched my arm. "Mr. Pendleton, stay with me. Look at the light right here." I looked at the light. Clara's hand found mine. She was sitting on the bench along the side wall of the ambulance, leaning forward. Both of her hands wrapped around my right hand, not gently, not carefully, but with a grip that was almost fierce, the grip of someone holding on, because letting go is not an option. They are willing to consider. Her face was wet. She had been crying without making any sound, which was so completely Clara, so entirely the person she had always been, the one who absorbed things privately, and only let you see the evidence afterward, that my throat closed completely. "Hey," I said from behind the mask. The word came out muffled and small. "Don't talk," she said. Her voice was steady in the way that voices get when the person using them is working very hard to keep them that way. "Just breathe. Just keep breathing, Dad." "Dad." She said it the way she had always said it, without thinking, without effort, the most natural word in her vocabulary. And something about hearing it in that particular moment, in that particular vehicle, with the siren above us, and the city moving past the small windows, something about it broke open a place in my chest that had nothing to do with the cardiac event. My eyes filled. I turned my face toward the ceiling of the ambulance because I did not want her to see it, and then I stopped caring whether she saw it, and the tears ran sideways across my temple and into my hair, and I did not try to stop them. I had not cried since that hospital bathroom 15 years ago. Not at the accident. Not when I found the bank statements. Not through any of the 1,000 smaller moments of the past 2 decades that had each taken something from me in increments too small to justify a response. But something about Clara's hands around mine and the word Dad said in the dark of a moving ambulance undid the last of whatever I had been holding together. I asked myself in the back of that ambulance the question I had been circling for 24 years, without ever landing on it directly. If I had said something sooner, if I had been the kind of man who named things instead of absorbing them, would any of it have been different? Clara squeezed my hand harder, as though she could feel the shape of the thought, even without knowing its content. Her thumbs moved across my knuckles in small, repetitive arcs, the way she had rubbed my hand when she was small, and sitting beside me during thunderstorms before she outgrew the fear. She had never outgrown the instinct. I had no answer to the question. None that satisfied. The honest answer was that I didn't know, that the variables were too many, and the past too fixed to be revised by speculation. What I knew was simpler and harder, that I had made choices consistently over a very long time, and that those choices had brought me to the back of this ambulance with a machine tracking my heartbeat and my daughter holding my hand like she was the one keeping me alive through sheer force of will. The siren changed pitch as we turned. The lights through the small windows shifted from the amber of residential streets to the brighter, colder white of the hospital approach. I made myself a promise in that ambulance, not out of anger, not out of the hot, reactive place that bad decisions come from somewhere quieter and deeper, from the place that had been waiting beneath all the silence for permission to speak. The last promise I would ever make from a place of fear. Clara squeezed my hand so hard I could feel her shaking. Or maybe that was me. The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was a ceiling I didn't recognize. White acoustic tile. A long fluorescent fixture running the length of it. A small brown water stain in the far corner that someone had painted over, but not quite hidden. The kind of ceiling you only notice when you have nowhere else to look, when the world has been reduced to what is directly above you, and your body is too occupied with the business of continuing to allow for anything more ambitious. I blinked. The room came into focus in stages the way vision returns, when the brain has been somewhere it shouldn't be, and is finding its way back carefully. There was a window to my left, blinds half open, morning light coming through in flat, pale strips. The particular gray-white of early September in Manhattan, the sky not yet decided about the day. A monitor to my right, tracking my heartbeat in small green peaks that seemed to my untrained eye reassuringly regular. An IV line in my left arm. The faint pressure of an oxygen cannula across my upper lip. I was alive. The fact arrived not with relief exactly, but with a kind of neutral recognition, the way you register a fact that is important but not yet fully real. Then I heard it, the sound that oriented me more completely than any of the visual details. Slow, soft, the slightly uneven rhythm of someone asleep in an uncomfortable position. I turned my head carefully to the right. Clara was in the chair beside my bed. She had fallen asleep with her coat still on one arm folded under her cheek, her legs curled sideways in a way that would leave her stiff for hours. Her hair had come half out of whatever she had put it in for the party, and there were the dried tracks of tears on her face that she hadn't had the chance or the awareness to wash away. She had not gone home. She had stayed through the night in a hospital chair in her party clothes, because the alternative had not occurred to her as an option worth considering. My throat tightened so quickly it surprised me. I had spent 24 years looking at the wrong person. I did not say that out loud. I stored it carefully in the part of myself that had been filling up slowly and silently for years, the part that was no longer accepting new deposits without interest. My phone was on the bedside table. Someone had plugged it in. Clara, probably that particular brand of thoughtfulness that anticipated needs before they were spoken. The screen showed 43% battery and 11 notifications. I picked it up with the hand that didn't have the IV line and scrolled through them slowly. 3 missed calls from Eleanor. 1 voicemail. 4 text messages sent between 11:30 the previous night and 6:17 that morning. I opened the messages in order. The first, the guests are asking questions. What should I tell them? The second, Arthur, the catering staff needs direction about cleanup. Are you able to call? The third, sent at 2 in the morning. I hope you're stable. Julian is very stressed about how tonight looked. He worked hard for this promotion. And the fourth, the one that arrived at 6:17 while I was presumably still unconscious. Are you awake? Julian lost face in front of his boss because of the ambulance siren. Come home as soon as possible. The house is still a mess. I read that last message 3 times, not because I didn't understand it. I understood it perfectly immediately, with a clarity that required no effort at all. I read it 3 times because I was waiting for something. Some flicker of the old response, the familiar tightening in my chest, that was different from the cardiac kind, the one that said, fix this smooth, find a way to make this easier for everyone, and it didn't come. For the first time in longer than I could accurately calculate, I felt nothing about Eleanor's words except a profound and clarifying absence of surprise. I set the phone face down on the bedside table and looked at the ceiling again. The door opened quietly. A man in his early 50s came in tall with the particular economy of movement that comes from decades of hospital rounds, wearing a white coat over a blue shirt, a stethoscope around his neck, a tablet in his left hand. He had silver-streaked hair cut short and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he moved into the room the way experienced doctors move without announcing himself, taking in the full picture before saying a word. Mr. Pendleton. His voice was moderate, measured with a quality of attention in it that I associated with people who had learned to listen before they spoke. I'm Dr. Robert Vance. I'm the attending cardiologist who managed your case last night. How are you feeling this morning? Like I spent the night in a hospital, I said. Something moved briefly at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of one. That tracks. He pulled the chair on the other side of the bed, the one without Clara in it, and sat down with his tablet scrolling through what I assumed were my results. Your troponin levels are elevated, which confirms that your heart was under significant stress last night. The good news is that the EKG shows no evidence of a full myocardial infarction. What you experienced was a severe angina episode, likely exacerbated by physical overexertion and acute emotional stress. In plain language, I said. He looked up from the tablet. Your heart was working in conditions it wasn't equipped to handle. The physical strain of moving heavy objects, combined with what I understand were significant stressors in your immediate environment, pushed your cardiovascular system to a point of crisis. He paused. Mr. Pendleton, your chart indicates this isn't the first time you've had symptoms like this. Smaller versions, I said, over the past several months, and you didn't seek evaluation. It wasn't a question. I answered it anyway. No. Dr. Vance nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has heard this particular admission many times and has learned not to spend energy on the frustration of it. You'll need to stay for observation, at minimum another 48 hours, possibly longer, depending on how your levels trend. Complete rest, no physical exertion, minimal stress. He looked at me steadily. That last one is going to require some active management on your part. Clara stirred in the chair. She made a small sound, disoriented, and opened her eyes, and for a moment, she simply stared at me, the way people stare when they wake up in a strange place, and their brain hasn't yet caught up with their circumstances. Then her eyes filled fast and completely, and she sat up straight and said, "Dad, you're awake." "I'm awake," I said. She pressed both hands over her mouth and closed her eyes for a moment. Breathing through it, and the sight of her doing that, the particular discipline of a person who has been holding something very large for a very long time, did something to the center of my chest that no cardiac monitor could have captured. Dr. Vance stood and gave Clara a brief, kind nod. "I'll leave you for a few minutes. Nurse will be in shortly." He paused at the door and looked back at me. "Complete rest, Mr. Pendleton. The next 48 hours matter." He left. The door swung closed softly behind him. Clara reached across and took my hand. Not with the fierce, shaking grip of the ambulance, but steadily, the grip of someone who has made it to the other side of the worst part and is still there. "Don't ever do that again," she said quietly. Not angry, just certain. "Do what?" "Tell everyone you're fine when you're not." I looked at her face, the dried tears, the hair escaping its pins, the coat she had slept in all night, and something settled in me with the weight of a decision that had been waiting a very long time to be made. Dr. Vance said I needed complete rest. He didn't know I had already decided that resting was the last thing I intended to do. I did not ask Clara to call Richard Henderson. She had already done it by the time I woke up, fully before the nurses had finished the morning vitals check, before Dr. Vance had completed his rounds, before I had assembled enough consecutive thoughts to form a plan. She had done it the way she did most things that mattered quietly, without announcement, and ahead of the moment when it became obvious to everyone else that it needed doing. I found out when Henderson walked through the door at 9:47 that morning. Richard Henderson was 55 years old, with the broad, unhurried build of a man who had played college football 4 decades ago and still carried the posture of it. He had been practicing law in New York for 28 years, property inheritance financial dispute, and he had the particular quality of stillness that comes from spending a career in rooms where everything said has consequences. He did not waste words. He did not perform confidence. He simply had it the way some people have blue eyes or a good sense of direction as a fixed feature rather than an achievement. He came in carrying a leather briefcase that had seen better decades, set it on the chair beside the window, and looked at me with an expression that managed to be both professionally neutral and personally concerned at the same time. "You look terrible," he said. "Good morning to you too, Richard," I said. He almost smiled. "Clara called me at 7. She said it was urgent and that I should bring the full file on the Elmridge property." He glanced at Clara, who was sitting on the other side of the bed, peeling an orange with the focused attention of someone who needed something to do with her hands. "She also said I shouldn't ask too many questions until I got here." Clara set a segment of orange on the edge of my tray without looking up. "Eat that," she said to me. "I'm not hungry. Eat it anyway. You haven't had anything since yesterday afternoon." I ate the orange segment. It tasted like citrus and like someone paying attention, which are sometimes the same thing. Thomas was in the corner of the room near the window. He had come in 20 minutes earlier, still in scrubs from a morning shift he had apparently rearranged to be here. He sat with his elbows on his knees, listening without inserting himself, the way a man does when he understands that his role in the room is to witness and support rather than direct. "Richard," I said when I had finished the orange segment and felt sufficiently steady to begin, "I need to revoke Eleanor's power of attorney today, before she has any opportunity to act on it." Henderson did not blink. He reached into his briefcase and produced a legal pad and a pen. "Tell me the scope of the current POA. Broad, financial and property decisions. She has signature authority on the joint accounts and—" I stopped. "She has access to everything that isn't in my name alone." "When was the POA executed?" 12 years ago. I signed it when I had the shoulder surgery she insisted in case something went wrong during the procedure. I never revoked it." Henderson wrote for a moment without speaking. Then he looked up. "To execute a valid revocation in New York, we need a written document signed by you in the presence of 2 witnesses or a notary. I have a notary on call who can be here within the hour." He paused. "Are you confident in your decision? I want to make sure Dr. Vance has documented your mental competency this morning, because Eleanor's attorney, if she retains one, will likely challenge the timing." "Ask Vance to put it in writing," I said. "He was here an hour ago. He can confirm I'm oriented and coherent." "Already requested," Clara said from behind the orange. She did not look up. Henderson and I both looked at her. She continued peeling with the same concentrated expression, as though she had not just revealed that she had anticipated this exact requirement before either of us had articulated it. "How long have you had that number?" I asked her. She placed another segment on my tray. "Henderson's—" a small pause. 4 years. 4 years." She had stored a lawyer's phone number for 4 years against a possibility she had never spoken aloud, because speaking it aloud would have required naming something that neither of us had been ready to name. My chest did that thing again, not the cardiac kind, the other kind, the kind that had no clinical term, but that I was beginning to understand was simply the feeling of seeing something clearly after a very long time of choosing not to look. Thomas shifted in the corner and cleared his throat quietly. "Arthur," he said, "while you and Henderson work through the POA, I can start pulling the security footage from the house. I have access to the system through the app on my phone. Clara gave me the login when we were managing the renovation last spring." He looked at me steadily. "The cameras on the exterior of the property would have captured the driveway and the service entrance. Everything from last night." I held his gaze. "Do it." He nodded once and looked down at his phone. Henderson produced a document from the briefcase, a standard revocation template. He explained that he would modify to reflect the specific scope. He walked me through each clause with the patient precision of a man who understood that the person across from him was recovering from a cardiac event and needed information delivered in manageable portions rather than all at once. When he reached the section regarding Eleanor's current access to the joint financial accounts, he paused. "Arthur," he said carefully, "there is one other matter I want to raise. You mentioned several years ago a situation involving your son and certain investment accounts. You told me at the time you had documentation, but were not prepared to act on it." He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "I want to make sure you understand that the statute of limitations in New York for wire fraud is 6 years from the date of the last transaction. Depending on exactly when those transactions occurred. 5 years ago," I said. "The last transaction was March 5 years ago," Henderson calculated briefly. "Then you have approximately 12 months remaining in the window." Another pause. "The question is whether you are now prepared to open it." The room was very quiet. Clara had stopped peeling the orange. Thomas had looked up from his phone. I thought about a drawer in a home office. Papers on the floor. A Thursday night in March alone with a desk lamp and the sound of a house that was asleep and didn't know what I knew. I thought about 11 minutes, about a message that said the house is still a mess. Henderson looked at me over his glasses and said, "Arthur, what's in that drawer you told me about? It may still be valid." I told him to open it. Henderson had been gone for 40 minutes when the door opened without a knock. I knew it was Julian before I turned my head. There was a particular quality to the way he entered rooms, not loudness exactly, but a displacement of air, a shift in the atmosphere that announced him, the way weather announces itself before it arrives. He had learned it somewhere in the past decade, that entrance. Or perhaps he had always had it, and I had simply spent too many years choosing to interpret it as confidence rather than what it actually was. He was still in work clothes. Charcoal trousers, a white shirt with the collar open, the jacket folded over his arm, with the careful precision of someone who has not forgotten that it cost $800. He looked from the doorway exactly like the version of himself he had spent years constructing, composed, assured, the kind of man other men in expensive suits defer to in conference rooms. He looked at me on the hospital bed with the tubes and the monitor and the cannula across my face, and his expression did something I had not expected. It softened. Not into concern, I want to be precise about that because the distinction matters. Not into the open, unguarded softness of someone who has walked into a room and felt the impact of what they are seeing. It softened in the calculated way of a man who has decided in the hallway outside exactly which expression will be most effective for the conversation he is about to have, and has arranged his features accordingly. "Dad," he said. The word landed differently than it used to. I had spent 6 hours on a moving ambulance and in a hospital bed thinking about that word, about the last time it had come from him and carried anything real, and now here it was offered freely, and I felt it for exactly what it was, a tool, selected and deployed. "Julian," I said. He came in and pulled the chair that Henderson had used, setting it beside the bed, with a deliberateness that suggested he had rehearsed the geometry of this visit. He sat down, draped his jacket over his knee, and looked at me with an expression of measured concern. "You gave us quite a scare," he said. I waited. "I know last night was complicated." He paused, choosing the word carefully. "There were a lot of moving parts. I made some decisions in the moment that I probably would handle differently with more time to think." Another pause. Victor was there. I was trying to manage a lot of variables at once. "Variables," I said. Something flickered behind his eyes, a brief recalibration. "You know what I mean, Dad." There it was again. Dad. Twice in 90 seconds. I counted because I had apparently reached the point in my life where I counted these things. "What do you have under your arm, Julian?" I said. He looked down at the folder he had been holding against his side. A manila folder, thick, rubber-banded. He had been carrying it when he walked in, and he had said nothing about it, letting the conversation establish itself, first warming the room, before he introduced the thing he had actually come to do. He set it on the bed beside my hand. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the practical realities of your situation going forward. Recovery takes time. You're going to need support. Financial management, property decisions. The Elmridge house is a significant asset, and with everything that's happened. Open it, I said. He did. Inside was a set of documents, clean, professionally prepared, the kind that come from a real estate attorney's office rather than a print shop. Property transfer documents. The Elmridge Drive property, the house I had purchased in 1997, 2 years before, I met Eleanor with a down payment drawn from 12 years of engineering contracts. My name on the original deed. Sole ownership, premarital, documented in a file cabinet in the home office alongside every other piece of paper that constituted my adult life. He had listed himself as the transferee. I looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. My hands were resting flat on the blanket over my lap. And I was aware of them in the specific way you become aware of your hands when you are working very hard not to let them do anything that would reveal what is happening inside you. You'll want to look at page 3, Julian said. His voice had shifted, the softness gone now, replaced by the register he used in professional settings, the one that assumed the other person in the conversation would eventually see reason. It's straightforward. A transfer of ownership into a family trust with me as the primary trustee. It protects the asset. Given your health situation, it makes sense to have someone with financial expertise managing. How old were you, I said, when you learned to walk? He stopped. What? How old? When you took your first steps? I looked up from the documents and met his eyes. I used to know the exact date. I wrote it in a book your mother kept. I don't remember the date anymore, but I remember what your hands looked like. You held onto the coffee table and you looked at me and your face. I stopped, steadied. You looked at me like I was the whole world, like the only thing between you and the floor was the fact that I was there. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Dad, you called me that then too, I said. You didn't think about it. It wasn't a strategy. It was just the word you used because it was true. The monitor beside me had been steady all afternoon, the small green peaks of a heart, doing its careful work. Now, as Julian reached forward and slid the documents closer to my hand, as the pen he produced from his shirt pocket clicked open in the quiet of the room, the peaks changed. Faster, higher. I looked at my son's hands, the same hands I had held when he was 3 years old, learning to walk, trusting me completely with the full weight of his small, unsteady body. And I felt the machine beside me begin to scream. The alarm was loud enough to bring 3 people running. I heard them before I saw them. Footsteps in the hallway. The particular quick rhythm of medical personnel responding to a sound they are trained to take seriously. And then the door swung open and a nurse came through, first already moving toward the monitor, with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this 100 times and intends to do it correctly every single time. He was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of steady physical presence that tends to make anxious rooms calmer simply by occupying them. His badge said, Raymond Cruz, R.N., Charge Nurse, Cardiac Care Unit. He took in the monitor readout in approximately 1 second, then took in the room, me in the bed, Julian standing beside it, the folder, and the open pen, the documents spread across the blanket. His eyes moved from the monitor to Julian, to me, and something in his expression settled into a particular professional alertness that was different from the routine attention he had walked in with. The on-call physician came in behind him, a young resident, whose name I didn't catch, who went immediately to the monitor and began adjusting settings with quiet competence. A second nurse followed, positioning herself near the IV line, checking the connection points with practiced hands. Julian had not moved. He was still standing beside the bed with the folder under his arm and the pen in his hand, and he was looking at the sudden population of the room with an expression that was working very hard to remain neutral and not quite succeeding. The pen, I noticed, had stopped clicking. Mr. Pendleton. Raymond's voice was even and unhurried, directed entirely at me. Your heart rate spiked significantly in the past 60 seconds. Can you tell me what's happening? I looked at him. Then I looked at Julian, at the folder, at the documents still spread across my blanket, at the pen held ready. My son came to discuss some paperwork, I said carefully. Raymond followed my gaze to the documents. He looked at them for a moment without touching them. Then he looked at Julian. Sir, he said with the particular courtesy that contains no warmth whatsoever, I'm going to need to ask you to step back from the bed. Julian's chin came up slightly. I'm his son. I have every right to— You have the right to visit, Raymond said. You don't have the right to conduct business with a cardiac patient whose heart rate just hit 140 in a monitored unit. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Step back from the bed, please. Julian stepped back. One step the minimum required, with the body language of a man conceding a tactical position rather than acknowledging a boundary. Raymond turned back to me. The resident was still working at the monitor, making notes in the chart, and the room had the organized quiet of a medical situation being managed rather than a crisis unfolding. My chest still felt tight, not the sharp, demanding tightness of the previous night, but something duller and heavier, like a hand pressing down. Mr. Pendleton, Raymond said, and his voice dropped slightly, not for privacy exactly, but in the way of someone who understands that what they are about to ask matters and deserves the full attention of both the person asking and the person answering. Do you feel safe continuing this conversation? The question sat in the room for a moment. I had been asked many questions in 56 years. Questions about load tolerances and structural integrity, about mortgage rates and insurance deductibles, about whether I was fine, whether I needed anything, whether I was going to make it to Julian's school showcase, whether I intended to come home from the hospital before the weekend. I had answered all of them with the particular efficiency of a man who had learned to process and respond without lingering too long on what the question actually cost him. This question was different because it was not asking whether I was medically stable. It was not asking whether my heart rate was manageable or whether the pain had subsided to an acceptable level. It was asking something that no one, not Eleanor, not Julian, not a single person in the 28 years of my marriage had ever thought to ask me in exactly those terms. Whether I felt safe. I looked at Julian. He was standing at the required distance now, the folder repositioned under his arm. His face arranged back into the composed expression, but his free hand, I noticed, had closed into a loose fist at his side, and the knuckles had gone the faint white of someone exerting control they would rather not have to exert. He was watching me with the focused attention of a man waiting for a specific outcome, the way you watch a negotiation you believe you have already won. I thought about 24 years, about a parking garage and a 7-pound promise, about a drawer full of papers that I had kept because some part of me had known even then that the truth had a shelf life, and eventually it would be time to use it. I thought about 11 minutes. I thought about the house is still a mess. I looked back at Raymond Crew's charge nurse cardiac care unit, a man I had known for less than 18 hours, who had just asked me the one question that mattered. No, I said. One word. 2 letters. The shortest sentence I had ever spoken that carried the full weight of everything I had chosen not to say for the better part of 3 decades. Raymond nodded once. Not with surprise, not with judgment, simply with the steady acknowledgement of a man whose job is to respond to information rather than evaluate it. He turned to Julian. Sir, I need to ask you to leave the room. The patient has indicated he doesn't feel safe continuing this visit, and under our patient rights policy that ends the visit. Julian's composure cracked. Not completely, not in the open, ugly way of someone losing control entirely, but at the edges where the calculation lived. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved from Raymond to me and back to Raymond with the quick, assessing shift of someone recalculating in real time. This is completely, he started. Sir? Raymond's voice had not changed in volume or tone. It did not need to. I won't ask again. Julian looked at me one final time. I held his gaze without expression, not in defiance, not in triumph, simply in the quiet steadiness of a man who has said what he meant and does not need to add anything to it. He gathered the folder. He capped the pen and put it in his shirt pocket. He walked to the door with the deliberate, controlled pace of someone determined to exit with their dignity intact. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before he finally left. He didn't look like my son anymore. He looked like a stranger who had run out of options. The room was quieter after Julian left. Not the comfortable quiet of a place where nothing needs to be said, but the particular stillness that settles after something has been decided. The way a courtroom goes, quiet after a verdict. Not because there is nothing left to feel, but because the feeling has moved past the point where words are the right container for it. Raymond had checked my vitals twice in the 20 minutes following Julian's departure, both times without commenting on the numbers, beyond a neutral nod that told me they were moving in the right direction. The on-call resident had updated my chart and left. The documents Julian had brought were gone. Raymond had removed them from my bed without being asked, placing them on the windowsill with the careful neutrality of a man who understood their significance without needing it explained. Clara had come back within the hour, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the family waiting area down the hall. She set one on my tray, kept one for herself, and sat in the chair beside the bed without asking what had happened. She already knew Thomas had texted her from the waiting room, where he had gone when Julian arrived, and she had read the message with the expression of someone receiving information they had been half expecting for a long time. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say anything that required a response. She simply sat and drank her coffee and was present in the way that some people are present, not just physically in the room, but they're actually paying attention, actually available. When Henderson knocked and let himself in at 7:45 that evening, the room shifted into a different register entirely. He had his briefcase again. He had changed into a different shirt since the morning, still professional, but the loosened collar of a man who had worked through the day without stopping. He looked at the coffee cups, looked at Thomas just behind him, looked at me, and pulled the chair from the corner without being invited. The notary confirmed the POA revocation is fully executed and filed, he said, opening the briefcase on his knee. Eleanor's signature authority on your joint accounts has been suspended pending the formal legal process. She'll be notified by the bank within 24 to 48 hours. How will she react? Clara asked. Henderson looked at her with the measured expression of a man who chooses his words carefully in rooms with family members present. She'll retain her own counsel. That's the expected response. He paused. Which is why what Arthur and I discussed this morning becomes relevant. The strength of your position depends significantly on what documentation exists and how recently it was created. He looked at me. You said open it. I want to make sure you understand what that means before we go any further. It means I'm done waiting, I said. Henderson nodded once, not with approval exactly, but with the recognition of a man who has been holding a file for 5 years and has just been told he can finally do his job with it. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning, all of it. So I did. I told him about the phone call from the compliance officer the March evening, the desk lamp, the papers on the floor. I told him about the 11 transfers, each carefully structured to stay below the federal reporting threshold of $10,000 executed over 14 weeks with the methodical patience of someone who had studied exactly how not to get caught. I told him about the fraudulent account opened with my social security number and my driver's license, and the brokerage firm that had flagged it during a routine internal audit. My voice was steady for most of it. It faltered once when I got to the part about sitting on the floor of the home office gathering the scattered pages, the part where I described pressing the heel of my hand against my eyes in the dark. Because I was 51 years old and I would not cry on a Thursday night over money that was already gone, and a son I still couldn't bring myself to stop protecting. Clara made a sound that was not quite a word. She set her coffee cup down and reached across and put her hand over mine on the blanket, and I stopped talking for a moment and looked at the ceiling and waited for my voice to come back. Thomas had been leaning against the wall near the window. He straightened now, and when I glanced at him, his jaw was set in the particular way of a man absorbing something that makes him angry on someone else's behalf, controlled, directed, the kind of anger that does not need to perform itself. "The footage from the exterior cameras," he said to Henderson. "I pulled it this afternoon. The driveway camera has clear footage of Julian redirecting the paramedics to the service entrance. Time-stamped. The delay is visible and measurable, 4 minutes and 38 seconds of unnecessary transit time documented in the metadata." Henderson's pen moved across the legal pad. "That's significant. In New York, deliberately impeding emergency medical services can be charged as a Class A misdemeanor, at minimum escalating to felony endangerment if the prosecution argues the delay contributed to harm." He looked at me. "Did Dr. Vance document the timeline of your care in his notes?" "He documented everything," Thomas said. "I checked the chart before I came in this evening. The notes reflect the delay in initial contact with a notation about suboptimal response time. He didn't know why at the time, but the documentation exists." Henderson wrote for another moment. When he looked up, his expression had the particular quality of a lawyer who has just watched a weak case become a strong one. "Two separate matters," he said. "The financial fraud 5 years ago, still within the 6-year window, solid documentary evidence, if the original account records are preserved." He looked at me. "Are they?" "In a fireproof lockbox in the Home Office," I said. "Everything. The original statements, the compliance officer's written follow-up, the account number of the fraudulent brokerage account. I kept all of it." Something shifted in Henderson's expression, not surprise, but a kind of deep, professional satisfaction. "And the obstruction of emergency services, current incident camera footage, medical documentation." He closed his legal pad. "Arthur, these are 2 separate filings. One civil, one criminal referral. I'll prepare both." He reached into the briefcase and produced the POA revocation documents already signed, already notarized, already filed. He set them on the tray beside my coffee cup, with the deliberate placement of a man marking a moment. "The drawer is open," he said quietly. I looked at the documents. I looked at Thomas by the window, and Clara beside my bed, both of them there, both of them present, both of them in this room by choice rather than obligation. For the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, I was not making a decision alone in the dark. Henderson closed his briefcase with a soft, final click. He stood, straightened his collar, and looked at me over his glasses with the expression of a man who has said everything that needs saying tonight. "Get some rest, Arthur," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." He didn't know how right he was. On the 3rd morning, I heard my wife's voice before I saw her. It came from the hallway outside my room, not the hushed, careful register that hospital corridors seem to impose on most people, but Eleanor's voice in full social register, the one she used when she wanted a room to know she had arrived and had opinions about what she found there. I had been awake for an hour already, sitting up in the bed that had been moved the previous afternoon from the cardiac care unit to a standard recovery room on the 4th floor. A room with a window that looked out over a small courtyard and enough space for a proper chair rather than the vinyl fold-out that Clara had spent 2 nights in. I heard Eleanor say to someone I couldn't see, "Which room? Tell me which room right now." I set down the water cup I had been holding and waited. The door opened. Eleanor came through first, and the sight of her stopped something in my chest that was not the cardiac kind. She was dressed carefully, too carefully, for a morning hospital visit, in a cream blouse and tailored slacks, and the pearl earrings she reserved for occasions where appearances required active management. Her makeup was precise. Her hair was done. She had prepared for this visit the way she prepared for everything that mattered to her there as a performance requiring the right costume. Julian was behind her in a different suit from yesterday navy. This time no tie, the studied casualness of a man who wants to appear less calculated than he is. He was on his phone when he came through the door, typing something, and he finished the message before he looked up. "Arthur," Eleanor said. Her voice had the particular vibration of someone who has been containing something since the previous afternoon and has decided this morning that the container is no longer necessary. "We need to talk, as a family. The conversation we had yesterday seemed fairly complete," I said. Her eyes moved around the room with the swift assessing motion of a woman cataloging her environment. She noted Clara's coat on the chair. She noted the 2 coffee cups. She noted the absence of Henderson's briefcase, which had been there the previous evening, and something in her expression relaxed fractionally incorrectly, interpreting the absence as an advantage. "What happened yesterday was a misunderstanding," she said, moving toward the bed. "Raymond, whatever his name is, overreacted. Julian was simply trying to help you think about the practical realities of—" "He brought property transfer documents to a cardiac patient's bedside," I said, "and asked me to sign them." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "He was trying to protect the asset, Arthur. You know how complicated these things get when there's a medical situation and no clear plan in place. He had your best interests, Eleanor." My voice came out quieter than I intended, which made it, I think, more effective than if I had raised it. "I know what he had." The room went still for a moment. Julian had stopped moving near the doorway. Eleanor pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was recalibrating. "We're going to go to the family lounge," she said, shifting tack with the practiced ease of someone who has spent decades redirecting conversations that weren't going her way. All 4 of us, somewhere more appropriate for a family discussion. It was the word family that did it, not in the way she intended, not as an invitation, not as a bridge, as a trigger, because I had been in this hospital for 3 days, and in those 3 days, the word family had been redefined for me in ways I was still absorbing, and the version Eleanor was offering bore so little resemblance to what I had come to understand. The word could mean that hearing her use it felt like watching someone hold up a counterfeit and call it currency. I pushed back the blanket and stood carefully. My legs were steadier today, the 3rd day, bringing with it a cautious return of physical reliability, and reached for the robe draped over the chair. "Fine," I said. The family lounge. We went down the hallway in a configuration that felt to me like a diagram of the past 28 years, Eleanor slightly ahead setting the pace, Julian flanking her, me behind as I had always been moving in the direction someone else had chosen. Except that Clara fell into step beside me as we passed the nurse's station, appearing from wherever she had been, the small consultation room she had been using as a base, I thought, and matching her pace to mine without a word. Thomas was 2 steps behind her. I had not asked them to come. I had not needed to. The family lounge was a large neutral room with upholstered chairs in inoffensive beige, a coffee station in the corner windows along one wall, and the particular acoustic quality of a space designed to absorb difficult conversations without amplifying them. 3 other families occupied corners of the room. A woman reading a paperback, 2 men talking quietly near the window, an elderly couple sharing a sandwich from a paper bag. Eleanor chose a cluster of chairs near the center of the room, which told me everything about her intentions. Not a private corner, the center, where she could be seen, where the conversation would have witnesses of her choosing. We sat. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap with the composed precision of someone who has rehearsed her opening. Julian sat beside her, ankle crossed over knee, projecting a calm that his eyes did not entirely support. "Arthur," Eleanor began, "I want you to understand that everything that has happened over the past 2 days has come from a place of genuine concern for you and for this family. The decisions Julian made on Friday night were made under pressure in a difficult situation, and while they may not have been, he directed the ambulance to the service entrance, Clara said. Eleanor looked at her daughter with the particular expression she reserved for interruptions from people she considered categorically less important than herself. Clara, I'm speaking to your father. And I'm speaking to you, Clara said. Her voice was steady in a way that I recognized. It was the steadiness of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something and has decided that today is the day. He redirected emergency medical personnel away from the fastest route to Dad because he didn't want his boss to see an ambulance at his party. That's not a decision made under pressure. That's a decision made for the wrong reason. Julian's composed expression developed a crack along one edge. You have no idea what you're... Julian. Clara looked at her brother with the level, unafraid gaze of someone who has spent 30 years being underestimated and has stopped finding it intimidating. You are not welcome here. Not in this room, not in this hospital, not near our father. If you stay in this room, I will call security. Julian's mouth opened. A sound started to come out, something between a laugh and a retort, and then it didn't because something in Clara's expression apparently communicated that she was not making a rhetorical point. Eleanor put her hand on Julian's arm. A restraining gesture, or perhaps a strategic one, pulling him back to regroup before he said something that made the situation worse. Arthur? Eleanor said, turning back to me with the practiced pivot of a woman who has spent a marriage managing damage control. Please, can we speak privately? Just the two of us without... I opened my mouth to respond, and then from somewhere behind me I heard a voice I had not heard in almost 20 years. Arthur, it said. I turned around. Victor Sterling and I used to play golf every other Saturday for 11 years. Not because either of us was particularly good at it. Victor had a handicap that he described as aspirational, and I had a swing that my left shoulder had been quietly sabotaging since the accident. But because we had both discovered sometime in our early 40s that golf was one of the few activities that gave two busy men a legitimate reason to spend 4 hours outdoors without anyone expecting them to be productive. We talked about work sometimes. We talked about our families sometimes. Mostly, we talked about nothing in particular, which is, I have come to understand, the highest form of friendship available to men of a certain age and temperament. We had lost touch when I retired early. Not deliberately, there was no falling out, no argument, no moment where the friendship broke cleanly. It simply faded the way things fade when the shared context disappears. He had a company to run. I had a shoulder that needed managing, and a marriage that required more maintenance than I had been acknowledging. The Saturdays stopped, and then the calls became occasional, and then occasional became rare, and then rare became the particular silence that men accept without naming, because naming it would require admitting that something was lost. I turned around and found him standing 6 feet behind me. He was in a good overcoat open at the collar, and he was looking at me with an expression I recognized from 100 Saturday mornings on a fairway, the particular focus of a man who has just taken in a situation and is deciding what it requires of him. Victor, I said. Arthur. He crossed the distance between us and put both hands on my shoulders carefully because he could see from the robe and the IV mark on my left arm that I was not a man who should be gripped too firmly, and looked at my face with the directness of someone who has known you long enough to skip the social scaffolding. Hal Morrison called me last night. He said he'd heard from someone at the hospital that you'd come in by ambulance. I thought about calling first, and then I thought... He shook his head slightly. I should have called sooner. Years sooner. You're here now, I said. Something in his expression settled the particular relief of a man who has been carrying a small private guilt and has just been told it isn't required. He released my shoulders and stepped back, and it was in that moment, as he turned slightly to take in the rest of the room, that he saw Julian. The change in Julian's face happened in increments too small for anyone who wasn't watching carefully to catch. The color didn't drain all at once, it receded the way tide recedes in a steady withdrawal that left something pale and exposed behind it. His posture, which had been carefully arranged into the crossed-arm composure of a man managing a family dispute, underwent a structural adjustment that looked from the outside like a building discovering its foundation was not what it thought. He said very quietly, "Mr. Sterling." Victor looked at him. The recognition was immediate. Not the surprised recognition of someone encountering the unexpected, but the quiet recognition of someone who has just understood something about a situation that previously had missing pieces. "Julian," Victor said. His voice was level and entirely unreadable. Eleanor, who had been watching this exchange with the alert, rapid attention of a woman recalibrating in real time, produced a smile so quickly it was almost impressive. She stepped forward with her hand extended and her voice pitched at the register she used for people she considered important. "Victor, what a coincidence. I'm Eleanor Pendleton, Julian's mother. We've heard so much about you. Julian speaks of you very highly. I'm so sorry you've come at such a difficult time for our family. Arthur's health has given us all quite a scare, as I'm sure you can imagine." Victor shook her hand, with the minimal courtesy of a man who has been in enough rooms to recognize when someone is performing rather than speaking. "Mrs. Pendleton," he said. Nothing more. Eleanor's smile held, but something behind it flickered the faint adjustment of a woman who has just realized that her usual tools are not going to be effective here. Victor turned back to me. Around us, the family lounge had developed the particular quality of a room where the other occupants are no longer pretending not to pay attention. The woman with the paperback had stopped reading. The two men near the window had stopped talking. Even the elderly couple with the sandwich had gone still. Arthurson Victor said, "I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want you to know that whatever you tell me stays between us unless you decide otherwise." He glanced at Julian, a brief measured glance that communicated a great deal in a very short time, and then looked back at me. "What happened Friday night, the full version, not the version I heard at the party." Julian took one step forward. "Mr. Sterling, I don't think this is the appropriate setting for—" "Julian." Victor did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The single word delivered in that particular register had the quality of a door being closed firmly. Julian stopped. I looked at Victor Sterling, a man who had spent 11 years on a golf course, with me talking about nothing in particular, who had driven to a hospital on a weekday morning because a mutual friend mentioned my name, who was now standing in a family lounge in a good overcoat, asking me a direct question and waiting for a direct answer. I looked at Julian. He was standing very still, and his face had the expression of a man caught between two forces of approximately equal magnitude, trying to calculate which direction offered the most viable path. There was no viable path. I could see that he understood it now too, in the specific, clarifying way that people understand things, when there is nowhere left to look except directly at them. "Victor," I said, "this is my son." Victor looked at Julian, then back at me. "This is your son," he said. I thought about 24 years. I thought about a parking garage and a 7-pound promise and a drawer full of papers I had kept because the truth needed somewhere to live while I was still too afraid to speak it. "That's a question," I said, "that I've been asking myself for a long time." The lounge went very quiet. Julian's hand, which had been resting loosely at his side, closed into a fist. Not quickly, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who is making a decision about what comes next and has not yet committed to it. Victor watched him. His expression had not changed, but his attention had. It had the quality now of someone who has received a piece of information and is deciding what to do with it. Julian looked at me with the expression of a man who has run out of moves and is considering making one last, terrible mistake. Before I reveal the full truth exposed in that hospital room, drop a comment with the word witness below so I know you're still here following this journey. Also, please note the upcoming events incorporate some fictionalized elements built for educational purposes and may not be completely factual. If you prefer not to listen, you can turn off the video right now. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when someone is about to say something that cannot be unsaid. I had been in that silence once before, the night I sat on my home office floor holding a bank statement that proved my son had stolen $200,000 from me. That night, I chose to fold the paper, slide it into an envelope, and say nothing. I had told myself it was love. Standing in the hospital common lounge on the third day, my IV line still taped to the back of my hand, my hospital gown underneath a cardigan Clara had brought from home. I understood finally that it had not been love at all. It had been fear. Victor Sterling had not moved from his spot near the window. He was a tall man, still broad-shouldered at 58, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms learning to read the room before opening his mouth. He was reading it now. I could see it in the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his hands stayed loose at his sides. Julian had stepped forward. His jaw was tight, and his voice carried that rehearsed steadiness I recognized from every dinner table argument we had never finished. "Victor," Julian said, "my father has been under an enormous amount of stress. The doctors have recommended rest, and I think what he's trying to say is, Julian." Victor's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Julian stopped. Victor looked at me, not at Eleanor, not at the door. At me. "Arthur," he said, "I've known you for 11 years. I've never once heard you complain about anything." He paused. "So I'd like to hear what you have to say, in your own words." The lounge was not a private space. It never had been. 3 other patients sat in chairs along the far wall, one elderly man with a crossword puzzle in his lap, a woman in her 40s scrolling through her phone, a younger man staring at the ceiling. 2 nurses stood near the station at the edge of the room. Raymond was among them, clipboard in hand, watching without pretending not to. Clara sat in the chair nearest to me. She did not reach for my hand. She simply sat straight, her coffee cup held in both palms, and looked at me with an expression that said, "I'm here. Whatever you decide." Thomas stood slightly behind her arms, crossed eyes on Julian. Eleanor had arranged her face into the expression I knew best, composed, slightly wounded, the look of a woman being treated unfairly in public. She had practiced that look for 30 years. It had worked on teachers, neighbors, Julian's school principal, my own mother. It had worked on me, too, for a very long time. I looked down at my hand, the one with the IV line. The bruise from the needle had spread slightly overnight, a faint yellowish ring beneath the tape. My hands used to be strong. Construction site hands, my first supervisor had called them. Hands that had poured foundations, checked load-bearing calculations, climbed scaffolding in February wind. I had built other people's houses for 31 years. I had never been able to build a safe place inside my own. "Victor," I said, "I need to tell you something. And I need to ask you to let me finish before anyone else speaks." Victor nodded once. "Go ahead." I heard Eleanor draw a breath. I did not look at her. 5 years ago, I said, I received a call from a compliance officer at Hargrove Financial. She told me that someone had opened a brokerage account in my name using my Social Security number. 11 transfers had been made from my retirement savings. The total amount was $200,000. I kept my voice level, an engineer's voice. Measurements, not accusations. The account had been opened using documents printed from my home office. The signature on the authorization form was mine. I did not sign it. The woman with the phone had stopped scrolling. Julian's face had gone the color of old concrete. "Dad." His voice came out lower than he intended. "This is not the place." "You're right," I said. "The place should have been my kitchen table 5 years ago. But I didn't do it there. I'm doing it here." I turned back to Victor. I kept the documents, every transfer record, the compliance report, the account application with my forged signature. I paused. I kept them because I thought eventually Julian would come to me, that he would tell me the truth, that I would have the chance to forgive him properly, not out of silence but out of choice. The elderly man with the crossword had set his pencil down. He never came to me, I said. What he did come to me with 3 days ago in this hospital was a property deed. He wanted me to sign my house over to him. The house I bought in 1997 before Eleanor and I were married. My separate property. I looked at Raymond briefly. Raymond's eyes were steady. The heart monitor spiked to 140 beats per minute in under 60 seconds. I have the medical record. I watched something move through Victor's expression. Not shock, Victor Sterling did not do shock, but something quieter. A door closing behind an understanding. On Friday night, I continued. When Thomas called emergency services, Julian redirected the paramedics to the service entrance at the back of the building. It added 4 minutes and 38 seconds to their response time. I said it the way I would have said it in a project debrief, calmly, with the timestamp. The security camera at the front entrance captured it. Thomas retrieved the footage. Julian made a sound half word, half breath. I stayed silent for 5 years. I said, because I believed that protecting my son was the same as loving him. I understand now that it was not. It was allowing him to believe that the rules did not apply to him, that I would always absorb the cost. I stopped. The room was very quiet. Victor had not moved. He was looking at Julian now, and Julian was looking at the floor, and Eleanor was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not calculation, but something close to the recognition that the ground had shifted permanently beneath her feet. I'm not telling you this to harm my son, I said to Victor. I'm telling you this because I am 56 years old. I am sitting in a hospital with a bruised hand and a cardiac warning on my chart, and I have spent too many years being afraid of what the truth would cost me. I looked at my hand again. It turns out, I said quietly, the silence was the expensive part. Victor exhaled through his nose. Slow, controlled. Then he looked at Julian, and Julian looked up. What passed between them in that moment was not something I could fully describe. But I saw Julian's throat move as he swallowed. I saw his hand, the one that had been clenched around his phone since the moment Victor walked in, go still. Clara set her coffee cup down on the side table. The small sound of ceramic on wood was the only thing that broke the quiet. And then Julian opened his mouth and took the step I had seen coming since the night before. Julian said, "You want to talk about documents?" His voice had changed. The rehearsed steadiness was gone. What replaced it was something raw, not grief, not remorse, but the particular desperation of a man who has just watched his last defensible position collapse and is now swinging at anything within reach. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and held it up. "Let's talk about documents," he said. "Let's talk about the fact that my father has been working with a lawyer behind the family's back for 3 days. That he had his own daughter call Richard Henderson before he was even fully conscious. That he has been building a case against his own son from a hospital bed." He looked around the room at the nurses, at the other patients, at Victor. "Does that sound like a sick man to you? Does that sound like someone who needs protecting?" "Julian." Thomas's voice was quiet. He had uncrossed his arms. "Stay out of this." Julian didn't look at him. "You married into this family 2 years ago. You don't get a vote." "I'm not voting," Thomas said. "I'm telling you to lower your phone." Julian's arm stayed up. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved to me, and I saw it. Then the thing I had been watching build since Friday night. It was not hatred. I had braced myself for hatred, and I could have borne it. What I saw was worse than that. It was the look of a person who had spent so long believing he was owed something that the moment the debt was canceled, He had no idea who he was without it. "You could have come to me," Julian said. His voice cracked on the last word just slightly, just enough. "5 years ago. You could have confronted me. You chose not to. That's on you." The room was very still. I had prepared for this too. Not consciously, but somewhere in the long corridor of the last 3 days in the ambulance in the ICU. In the quiet after Henderson left, I had turned this moment over in my mind, the way you check a structural calculation twice before signing off on it. "You're right," I said. Julian blinked. "I should have confronted you 5 years ago," I said. "I didn't. I made that choice and I own it." I paused. "What you made was a different choice, and that one is on you." Something moved through Julian's face, a flash of something that might in another life have been the beginning of an honest conversation. But it passed. He stepped forward. He did not touch me. I want to be clear about that. What he did was close the distance between us by 4 feet and extend his hand toward the folder on the table beside me, the folder Henderson had left containing the preliminary fraud filing documents. His movement was sharp and fast, and in the confined space of the lounge with my IV line still attached with my heart rate already elevated, it was enough. Clara stood up. She did not shout. She placed herself between Julian and the table with the precise, deliberate movement of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in her own mind for longer than I had known. "Don't," she said. One word. She had always been economical with her words, my daughter. An engineer's child through and through. Julian stopped. He looked at Clara the way people look at something they have underestimated for too long, with a sudden, belated recalibration. Thomas had moved as well. He was standing beside Clara now, not aggressively, but with the particular stillness of an emergency physician who has spent years learning to fill a room without escalating it. "I need everyone to take a step back," Thomas said. He had used that voice before in trauma bays in the controlled chaos of an emergency room at 2 a.m. It was not loud. It did not waver. Right now, Raymond had already reached for the phone at the nurse's station. Julian did not step back, but he did not step forward either. Victor Sterling, who had not moved from his position near the window since Arthur began speaking, finally shifted. He straightened. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked at Julian with an expression so devoid of warmth that it was almost clinical. "Julian," he said, "that's enough." "Victor, I can explain. I have been standing in this room," Victor said, "for the last 11 minutes. I have heard what Arthur said. I have watched how you responded to it." He paused. "Sterling Capital cannot have a senior investment analyst under a fraud investigation at the company. I think you know what that means." Julian's throat moved. "Effective immediately," Victor said. "You are suspended with pay pending a formal HR review. Do not contact clients. Do not access company accounts. Do not come into the office." He looked at Julian steadily. "We will be in touch through proper channels." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Eleanor made a sound, something between a breath and a word that never formed. She reached for Julian's arm. He did not respond to her touch. He was still looking at Victor, and on his face was an expression I recognized not from looking at Julian, but from looking at old photographs of myself, the expression of a man who has just understood all at once and far too late the full weight of what he has done. The door to the lounge opened. Officer Marcus Briggs was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with the measured, unhurried walk of a man who had responded to enough situations to know that urgency and speed are not the same thing. He wore a standard NYPD uniform and carried a small notepad. Raymond had reached him quickly. He surveyed the room, once identified the relevant parties, and moved to the center of the space. "I understand there's been a disturbance," he said. His voice was neutral, professional. "I'm going to need the non-patients to step into the hallway, please." Eleanor straightened her blouse. It was such a particular gesture, so precisely her, that I almost felt something. Almost. Julian did not look at me as he walked to the door. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw set, his phone pressed flat against his thigh. Eleanor followed him, and for one moment, one brief, unguarded moment, she turned back and looked at me across the lounge. I had spent 30 years trying to read that face. I let it go. Officer Briggs remained in the doorway, speaking quietly to Julian and Eleanor in the hall. Clara sat back down beside me. She did not say anything. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. Thomas rested a hand briefly on my shoulder, 1 hand, 1 second, the practiced reassurance of someone who understood that sometimes the body needs to be reminded it is still there. Victor walked to where I was sitting. He stood for a moment looking down at me with the expression of a man doing the math on something he wished he had calculated sooner. "I'll be in touch," he said quietly. He left. Raymond checked my pulse, 62, he said, which surprised us both and made a note on his clipboard. The elderly man across the room had picked up his pencil again. The woman in her 40s was looking at her phone, but not scrolling. The young man on the ceiling-staring chair had his eyes on the door. The lounge was very quiet. Outside the window, Manhattan moved the way it always did, indifferent, continuous, unhurried by the small and enormous things happening inside the buildings it surrounded. Clara reached over and took my hand. Not the one with the IV, the other one. "It's done," she said. I looked at the empty doorway where my son had been standing. "Not yet," I said. "Nobody tells you what it feels like after the room clears, after the voices stop, after the door swings shut on everything you spent 30 years not saying. Nobody tells you that it does not feel like winning. It feels like standing in a house after a storm has moved through the wind, is gone, the walls are still standing. But there is glass on the floor, and you are not sure yet if your hands are steady enough to clean it up." Raymond guided me back to my room at 2:30. He did not make conversation. He checked the IV line, adjusted the drip, noted something on his clipboard, and said, "Your blood pressure is actually better than this morning." He said it the way people say true things they find mildly surprising. Then he left, pulling the door to within an inch of closed. Clara came in 3 minutes later. She had stopped at the vending machine in the hallway. I could tell because she was carrying 2 bottles of water and a granola bar she clearly did not intend to eat. She set them on the bedside table, pulled the chair close, and sat down. She did not ask me how I was feeling. That was the thing about Clara. She had never asked how I was feeling in the way people ask when they want a specific answer. She asked it the way a person asks when they are prepared to sit with whatever the real answer turns out to be. She peeled open the granola bar and broke it in half. She handed me the larger piece without comment. I took it. Outside the window, the afternoon had gone, the particular gray of a Manhattan October. Not raining, not quite, not raining the sky, the color of old concrete. I had poured foundations in weather like this. I had read blueprints in weather like this. I had driven home from job sites in weather like this for more years than I could easily count, always with the particular satisfaction of a man who has done a day's honest work. I had not felt that in a long time. "I owe you an apology," I said. Clara looked up from her water bottle. "For what?" "For making you grow up in a house where you had to learn to take the subway alone at 7 years old, to bring your father lunch," I said. "I should have fixed it sooner." She was quiet for a moment. She had my eyes the same gray, the same tendency to go still when thinking rather than look away. "You did the best you knew how," she said. "And then today you did better." She paused. "That's all any of us can do, Dad." I had not cried in the lounge. I had not cried in the ambulance, not really, not fully. I had held it with the discipline of a man who learned young that certain things are done privately. I cried now, not loudly, not dramatically. The kind of crying that happens when something that has been held under pressure for a very long time is finally allowed to release, slow and deep and exhausting, in the way that relief is always exhausting. Clara did not move toward me. She did not say anything. She simply stayed in the chair present and still the way she had been staying in rooms for me since she was 7 years old. After a while, I wiped my face with the back of my wrist. "Thomas is getting the security footage copied to Henderson," she said when I was ready. "He said the timestamps are clean. Henderson thinks the civil filing can move forward within the week." "Good," I said. "You don't have to think about any of that tonight." "I know." I looked at the window. The gray had deepened slightly. "I'm not thinking about it." What I was thinking about was simpler than any of that. I was thinking about the granola bar and the water bottle and the chair pulled close and the particular quality of my daughter's stillness. I was thinking about how a person can spend decades looking in the wrong direction and still, if they are fortunate, turn around in time to see what was always there. I was not all right. My shoulder still ached from 3 days of hospital beds. My chart had the word cardiac on it. My son had been suspended from his job and escorted from the building by a police officer. My wife of 30 years had walked out a door without looking back. I was not all right, but for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, I was not pretending to be. There is a difference between those two things. It took me 56 years to understand it. I am not proud of how long it took, but I am grateful, genuinely, quietly grateful that I got there at all. Clara stayed until the dinner tray arrived. She straightened my blanket, told me Thomas would be back by 8, and picked up her coat from the back of the chair. At the door, she stopped. "Dad," she said without turning around. "Yeah, I found something in the hallway, outside the lounge." She paused. "I left it on the nurse's station. Raymond has it." Another pause, smaller. "You don't have to read it tonight." She left. I looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then I reached for the call button and pressed it once. Raymond came in at 7:15. He was holding a plain white envelope, no stamp, no return address, just my name written in Eleanor's handwriting across the front. Arthur. She had always written my name the same way every birthday card, every grocery list left on the counter. Precise, unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world. He set it on the blanket beside my hand. "Found it at the nurse's station," he said. "Someone left it there before they went downstairs." He paused at the door. "You need anything, the button's right there." He left. I looked at the envelope for a long time without touching it. The dinner tray was still on the table, half eaten. Outside, the city had gone properly dark, and the window had turned into a mirror. I could see my own reflection in it. A man in a hospital cardigan, sitting very still. I picked up the envelope. I opened it. There were 2 pages inside written by hand. The first page was Eleanor's. The second was Julian's. I could tell by the handwriting before I read a single word. His letters had always leaned slightly to the right, as though everything he wrote was in a hurry to get somewhere. I read both pages. I will not repeat what they said. Not because it was cruel, it wasn't, not entirely, but because the words on those pages were the words of 2 people writing to the version of me they needed me to be, not the version sitting in this room. Eleanor wrote about the family, about appearances, about what people would think. Julian wrote about his career, about the pressure he had been under, about how I had never understood what it cost him to carry the weight of our family's expectations. He was not wrong about the pressure. He was not wrong about the expectations. He was wrong about who had been carrying them. I folded both pages back along their original creases. I slid them into the envelope. I held the envelope for one moment, feeling the slight weight of it, the smooth paper, 30 years and 24 years, compressed into 2 handwritten pages. Then I set it on the bedside table face down, not in the trash. I was not angry enough for that, and I was not sentimental enough to keep it somewhere meaningful. I simply set it down the way you set down something you have finished with, without ceremony, without drama. I reached for my phone. I had one message from Henderson sent at 6:42, "Documents ready for your review tomorrow morning. Get some rest." I typed back, "I'm ready." Then I turned off the lamp, lay back against the pillow, and closed my eyes. For the first time in 5 years, I did not dream about the drawer. Henderson arrived at 8:12, exactly when he said he would. He set his briefcase on the chair, clicked it open, and laid 4 documents across my blanket in a straight row without saying anything beyond "we'll go left to right." The first was the TRO confirmation. Eleanor could no longer access our joint accounts until a formal hearing. Henderson had filed it 2 days prior. The court had granted it at 7:45 that morning, while I was still watching the ceiling turn from gray to pale gold. I signed it. The second was the fraud referral authorization. 40 pages assembled overnight by Henderson's paralegal. Everything from the fireproof lockbox, the compliance report, 11 transfer records, the forged account application, now formally submitted to the New York County District Attorney's Office. "Once this goes in," Henderson said, "it's out of your hands." "Good," I said. I signed it. The third was the updated will. 2 beneficiaries, Clara Ann Pendleton Albright and Thomas James Albright, equal shares. Raymond Cruz stood beside the bed as witness initialed his line without comment and stepped back. He had been doing that all week, showing up, doing the necessary thing, stepping back. I was grateful for it in a way I didn't have the right words for yet. I signed it. The fourth document was 1 page. A financial separation instrument, not a divorce filing, but the first clean line drawn between my name and everything that had been tangled around it for 30 years. I signed it. Henderson closed the briefcase. The clasp made a sound I felt in my chest, not painfully, completely. He paused at the door. "Arthur, check the numbers today. Dr. Vance thinks tomorrow morning is possible." "Clara knows," I said. He nodded and left. The room was very quiet. The sunlight had moved to the far wall. The drawer was empty. I had one more thing left to do. Looking back at my life, I realized that silence is a dangerous foundation. Don't be like me, absorbing decades of emotional abuse just to keep a false peace. I used to think protecting my son meant hiding his sins, but it only fed his extreme narcissism. True love demands boundaries. God knows I learned this lesson the hard way, right on a hospital bed. Every family story has its hidden cracks, but ignoring them will eventually cause a total structural collapse. Now, as I sit quietly here with Clara, I know what matters. This is not just one of those ordinary grandpa stories you listen to before bed. It is a raw family story about reclaiming dignity. We must stop carrying heavy burdens for people who would gladly watch us suffocate. I hope my family story teaches you to speak up before your heart breaks. These real-life grandpa stories are not always easy to share, but the truth heals. Let my experiences be the warning you need. Pass these profound grandpa stories to the next generation. What are your thoughts on my choices? Please leave a comment below, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and deeply touching narratives. Thank you very much, and sincerely for watching until the very end. A gentle warning. Subsequent stories may contain fictionalized elements constructed purely for educational purposes. If you prefer not to listen, feel free to exit and choose alternative productions that fulfill your direct viewing desires.